Welcome, everyone, to those here in person and to those joining us online. We welcome you to the Bloomberg Center. We're a university-wide center dedicated to advancing urban problem solving and leadership. My name is Kim Leary, and I'm an Emma Bloomberg Lecturer in Public Policy and Management here at the Kennedy School and an Associate Professor at Harvard Medical School. And I have the pleasure of serving as moderator. Today's event is a wonderful example of how research responds to the needs of city leaders. And we have some mayors in our audience in the room and online. We know that city leaders need actionable evidence that they can use to drive progress. Today's event is also an opportunity for you to see how faculty and students can partner to deliver exactly that evidence. I also have the privilege of serving as the faculty chair of the Collaboration Track, a Bloomberg Harvard City Leadership Program started by Jorrit, Jong, the director of the center, whom you'll hear from shortly. And in this role, I've been able to work with many city leaders, and I've seen the challenges that they face close up. Many of those challenges are ones that City Hall can't solve on their own. They need partnerships with the business community, with nonprofit organizations, so that they can benefit from their expertise and the expertise of residents. Each of these City Hall business residents come with unique knowledge that, if leveraged well, can create more robust solutions. So there's a real need for research-based guidance on how to make collaborations happen in order to tackle the biggest problems facing cities. And that's what we're going to hear about today. We'll hear from a team of researchers, the folks who are gathered here on stage, about what motivated their work and how their findings can enable cities, your cities, to deliver even more value to residents and to communities. So let's begin. I'm going to briefly introduce the panelists, and then we're going to get right to it. So directly to my right is Professor Jan Rivkin of the Harvard Business School. Seated right next to him, Professor Jorrit de Jong of the Harvard Kennedy School and the director of the Bloomberg Center for Cities. And then our first speaker, Santiago Santi Pulido Gomez, who is a PhD candidate at Harvard Graduate School of Education and defending his dissertation next week. But even before, he served as a policy analyst in his home country of Colombia in different ministries. He also is a graduate of this school with an MPP from the Kennedy School. So with that, Santi will begin our program by presenting the research for all of us to learn together about what this article has in store.
Okay, so good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being here. My name is Santiago Pulido Gomez, and on behalf of my co-authors and mentors, Professor Jorrit de Jong and Professor Jan Rivkin, I'll be presenting our academic paper titled Cross-Sector Collaboration in Cities, Learning Journey or Blame Game. Let me start with two cases as illustrations, or in other words, a tale of two collaborations. Roughly a decade ago, a coalition of industry leaders, businesses, nonprofits, and community organizations in a city in the US got together to solve the traffic congestion problems they were facing as a community. Their intended solution was to try to raise funds for infrastructure projects that would ease the traffic congestion. But how? In their first attempt, they tried to pass a ballot measure for a sales tax increase. However, this initiative will soon hit its first major setback. They flopped at the ballot box. Another cross-sector collaboration that started around the same time was trying to solve a different problem. They wanted to improve the STEM gap in knowledge and skills of underserved students. Launched by a retired teacher who joined forces with a regional nonprofit, the collaboration gathered support from a higher education institution, some multinational corporations, nonprofits, and community organizations. The collaboration notched some initial wins, such as a summer camp and some weekend events, but it was only a matter of time before this collaboration hit a setback too. the external funding became less available, and the collaboration faced difficult decisions regarding the best use of its funds. Up until this point, there doesn't seem to be important differences between these cases. In these and the other collaborations that we studied, a group of organizations from different sectors voluntarily got together to try to collectively solve a specific problem and produce public value. This process yielded some initial progress, but eventually all collaborations encountered setbacks early on. However, collaborations started to diverge when they encountered these setbacks. What happened in the wake of these setbacks was key. Our research proposes that how collaborations respond to setbacks can help us distinguish between effective and ineffective collaborations. In response to their loss at the ballot, the first collaboration rallied behind a newly elected mayor to devise a second effort. Together, they engaged with the community, figured out reasons for their failure, and adapted their strategy. 2 years later, a new ballot measure to raise taxes passed with bipartisan and cross-sectoral support. On the contrary, and in response to the funding setback, the second collaboration faced internal division between local and regional interests, and the different sectors focused on what divided their perspectives. The partnership succumbed to infighting and inaction. Funding dried up, and the nonprofit hosting the collaboration decided to stop doing so. As these two examples show, cross-sector collaborations vary dramatically in their success. Our research proposes that cross-sector collaborations that use failure as an opportunity to learn and adapt, like the first collaboration did, are likely to survive and thrive, while those that do not, like the second one, are more likely to fail. So now let me go back to the elements that motivated this research. The hardest problems that communities face, from creating economic and educational opportunity to ensuring public safety, require the knowledge, skills, and resources of multiple sectors, including government, business, and nonprofits. City governments alone rarely have enough resources, authority, and expertise to achieve public goals like reducing crime or creating economic opportunity, so they partner with businesses and nonprofits to pursue such aims. Similarly, private and nonprofit organizations often rely on effective collaboration with City Hall and with each other to accomplish their goals. Increasingly, scholars and practitioners conclude that addressing complex social issues, often characterized by uncertainty, volatility, and value conflict, requires cross-sector collaboration. Despite how common these collaborations are, cross-sector efforts in cities vary dramatically in how effective they are. And research to date has provided little insights regarding what distinguishes successful collaborations from failures. In this study, we aim to learn about the roots of such differences. Specifically, we asked ourselves what helps and what hinders the design and management of cross-sector collaboration in cities. Or in other words, what distinguishes effective from ineffective cross-sector collaborations. To explore this question, we examined 9 cross-sector collaborations across 3 cities and 3 policy areas through a case study design that we call a 3x3. Most prior investigations have analyzed a single cross-sector collaboration in depth or compared multiple cross-sector collaborations in a single policy area, making it difficult to generalize insights or compare across policy domains. In contrast, our distinctive approach allowed us to build hypotheses that span specific cities and policy areas. As part of this methodological approach, we examined a carefully selected set of collaborations. We started with a list of 59 US cities whose mayors had attended our leadership development program and a list of 6 policy challenges commonly addressed using cross-sector approaches. We used rigorous screening criteria around cities, types of policy issues, and collaboration characteristics. For instance, we required collaborations to involve at least 2 sectors and to have existed for 3 to 7 years. We went down the list of cities using public sources to identify candidate collaborations in the 6 domains and corroborating that they fulfilled our predetermined criteria. We continue going down the list, identifying and screening collaborations until we completed our 3x3 matrix, 3 cities with 3 cross-sector collaborations in the same 3 policy areas. The policy issues that fulfilled our design were education, public safety, and economic development. the cities must remain anonymous to preserve confidentiality, and we will refer to them as cities alpha, beta, and gamma. In terms of data collection, for each collaboration, we conducted individual interviews as well as group interviews and group exercises with members of all contributing organizations. We also looked at archival documents. Additionally, for each city, we conducted semi-structured interviews with the mayor to better understand the institutional environment. Data were analyzed in sequential iterative cycles, and the multiple cycles involved going back and forth between the final constructs and individual cases to develop a theory that felt robust across issues and across cases. Our process yielded multiple data points that indicated how much progress each collaboration had made towards delivering public value. We combined multiple indicators and data from many sources to determine the progress each collaboration had made. Using this approach to assess and rank the selected 9 collaborations, we found stark differences in progress across them. We classified our 9 collaborations into 3 tiers of success and compared the journeys of the more successful ones versus the less successful ones. As we iterated, a strong pattern started to emerge in the trajectory that the collaborative process followed. I will now share our findings with the disclaimer that although our study offers strong hypotheses about the roots of cross-sector collaboration success, further research is needed to test the theory we propose. So we found that all cross-sector collaborations required initial trust among members to get off the ground. And all encountered setbacks early on. But what happened in the wake of the setbacks was key. Some collaborations responded by engaging in a trust-building process of mutual learning. They participated in joint problem solving. That is, they saw the problems as shared, came together, and went through various iterations to co-produce solutions. As the figure in the slide shows, this mutual learning reinforced their trust in one another despite the setback and enabled them to get back on track towards success. In contrast, other cross-sector collaborations, even ones that enjoyed quick wins at the beginning, responded to setbacks by blaming each other, fighting amongst themselves, and disengaging. These cross-sector collaborations spiraled downwards toward failure. Members' trust in one another eroded, and little public value was delivered. So going back to the 2 illustrative collaborations from the beginning, in the first one, members rallied and made a second effort, engaged with the community, learned from their failure, and adapted their strategy. The second collaboration, on the other hand, focused on the things that divided them, which led them to infighting and inaction. Overall, across the different cases that we study, the most successful collaborations responded to setbacks by engaging in a trust-building process that we label mutual learning, while the less successful collaborations responded in ways that led to a trust-eroding process that we call mutual blaming. Or in other words, the first collaboration responded to setbacks by embarking on a learning journey, while the second one responded through a blame game. So for the policymakers and sectoral leaders in the room, and on Zoom, you may be asking yourselves, what can you do up front to raise the odds of a learning journey and reduce the odds of a blame game? Through our study, we not only looked at the patterns in their journeys, but we also identified 5 key actions that, according to members of the collaborations, launched a cross-sector collaboration towards a path of mutual learning. As I go through each of them, please feel free to read some of the illustrative quotes from some of the participants. So first, building on prior relationships. When organizations and individuals had worked together effectively in the past, it was easier to build the trust required to start a new collaboration and to respond to setbacks by learning together. Second, relying on a trusted individual. In the more successful collaborations, a well-known individual with strong and long-standing relationships and reputation across sectors made partners confident that the collaboration was possible, even when things didn't go as hoped. Collaboration takes effort, and people want to see a return on investment. Skilled and experienced navigators increase trust in the likelihood of that happening. 3, engaging the community. Generating input and feedback from residents and businesses in all stages of the process can result in better plans with broader support for implementation. the more successful collaborations in our study leveraged existing community spaces or designed new platforms for engaging with the community. 4, using data and evidence. To better understand problems and guide discussions, collaborations not only collected and analyzed data, but also found opportunities to review them together. These help partners align perspectives, develop well-informed plans, monitor progress, evaluate results, and crucially, avoid a blame game. 5, deliberately investing in joint problem solving. Some of the more successful collaborations were intentional in creating dedicated time and space for troubleshooting. These helped collaborators come together and discuss how things were going and what changes were needed. Setting expectations for open and constructive communication, we argue, is important since it reminds people that joint problem solving is an integral part of being on a learning journey together. A final recommendation, in addition to these 5 actions: don't fall into the trap of seeking the perfect governance model. Among the 9 collaborations we studied, no single collaboration governance model or structure made a collaboration more or less likely to succeed. The 3 least successful collaborations used 3 different governance models, and the 3 most successful ones also employed 3 different models at different times. What made the difference, rather, was the collaboration's willingness to adapt its governance model as the needs of the collaboration changed. In fact, several of the more successful ones we studied switched their governance models, while none of the less successful ones did. In sum, our city's toughest problems require the skills, resources, and energy of actors in multiple sectors. They require cross-sector collaboration. But collaborations across sectors is hard, in part because setbacks are inevitable. To help boost the odds of collaborative success, our findings suggest that you may want to, first, spend time upfront with partners discussing how will you react to setbacks. Second, incorporate the 5 actions that we pinpointed earlier. And third, avoid falling into the trap of seeking the perfect governance model. We hope that these recommendations are helpful, and we invite you to read our full article in the Journal of Public Administration Research and Theory and our practitioner-oriented piece published in the Stanford Social Innovation Review. Since I have 1 minute left, let me take 30 seconds to express our gratitude to our research assistants for their invaluable contribution. Thank you also to Professor Mark Moore for his generous feedback, and to our research interviewees for their time, insights, and candor. Finally, I personally want to thank the Bloomberg Harvard City Leadership Initiative for making this research possible and for giving me the opportunity to participate in this project. I'm also deeply grateful to my co-authors and mentors, Professor Jorrit de Jong and Professor Jan Rifkin. I want to express the deepest gratitude for the time and energy that you have invested in me as a scholar throughout our joint problem solving, in this collaborative research process. You have not only inspired me to pursue an academic career, but you have also allowed me to learn alongside you, instilling in me the joy and excitement for conducting research. Finally, to my partner, Matt, who has been there for me in the good days and the not so good days, I can't thank you enough for always being there for me. We'll now take questions, and thank you very much for your attention.
Santi, thank you so much for such a rich presentation and a heartfelt one. When we think about academic research, sometimes we think about the graphs and the numbers. We don't always think about the people and what goes into such a project. Thank you for taking us behind the scenes of what is really involved in producing high-quality academic research on real problems that can deliver real value to communities and cities. So as we move into the panel discussion part of the program, I'm going to ask Santi the first question to give us a bridge from the research findings into what we hope will be a broader discussion, including with all of you and those online. So you spent a lot of years doing this research, some time really invested in your hypotheses, understanding what the motivation was for doing it. But what's one thing the evidence showed you that you just didn't expect? something that shifted or surprised for you in how you think about collaboration in this context?
Sure. Yeah. No. And I think that like when I first started this project, I came from working in the public sector, and I had not been in academia or I hadn't done research before, and so I was, let's say, approaching this research project from a practitioner perspective, right? And so I was going through the literature review before we started collecting the data with my policy hat, right? Like my policymaker hat. I was just thinking about the fact that there was this need for a backbone organization, right? That there was this need for someone to take the lead or for one of the members of the collaboration to just like take some more responsibility than the rest, right? And for me, that made sense. And also I read some of the articles, for example, in terms of collective impact that reinforced this idea that the structure was important, right? And I think that like as we were going through the data, one of the things that really surprised me was that was not necessarily the case, right? That there was this like need for adaptability that was much more important than that. And despite the fact that, you know, sometimes you have this bias going into learning about these things that you just want to see it reflected in the data, I think that like through the conversations that we had as a research group, we found that like that was definitely not the case. And I think that like going through these different things, it was interesting to actually see how sometimes a structure that I would have not thought was enabling that collaboration, such as a shared governance, ended up doing so, right? And started creating the trust that was necessary. And I think that like to also respond to like that question from more of like a research like a researcher perspective, right? And very briefly, I do think that it was surprising for me now from the research side to see that definitely from the practitioner side, there's this skepticism, but also curiosity to engage in this type of research, right? And I was a practitioner myself who sometimes was skeptical about, you know, people from universities or just like sitting, you know, in this ivory tower, just like, you know, thinking about these things that could or could not apply to my own specific context. And I think that in the process of doing the research, I'm glad that our participants, you know, the curiosity was much more and they were willing to engage in this process of collaborating with us so that we could learn from them, right? And I think at our own different paces, it was just exciting as a student to see this collaboration in terms of learning from their reflections. And now it's the time to sort of like give back through our reflections after studying all of these different cases. So that's more like on the process, on the research process statement, on the research process side of things, what I found, you know, interesting and surprising and new.
Well, that's terrific. A collaboration between practitioners and researchers about collaboration.
Meta.
Meta, pretty
meta.
But wonderfully practical too. Jan,
Yes.
You are the C. Roland Christensen Professor of Business Administration at the Harvard Business School. And I think what that means is that you do a lot of teaching and advising of companies, organizations, and governments about strategy, and strategy in particular. So I wonder if we could invite you to share with us what you see through a strategy lens about how city leaders can be better prepared for that learning journey. How can they prepare for setbacks before they even occur?
Great, thank you, Kim. And actually, before I answer, can I just take a few words to like celebrate Santi?
Yes.
And maybe embarrass him a little bit in a wonderful way. I hope in a good way. Santi's a doctoral student. This is his first refereed publication, right? And moreover, he's the first author on this paper. And rightly so. Those 100+ interviews, Santi was there for everyone. He not only did the legwork, he did the brain work, right? Full partner in the creation of the key ideas. So I just want to say bravo and congratulations, Santi. May this publication be the first of many. So,
absolutely.
To your question, Kim. How can city leaders be better prepared for engaging in the learning journey? So. I think the research points to some insights there. I hope it does. So imagine that you were initiating a cross-sector collaboration in our hometown of Boston.
Okay.
And you came to me for advice. What did you learn from this paper? And I think here's the three things I'd say. First, I'd say, Kim, I know you're really excited about this cross-sector collaboration. You should be. But I want you to know the collaboration is going to face setbacks. They are not optional, right? One of the striking things about the research is all 9 of our collaborations encountered setbacks, some of them multiple setbacks. So first thing, individually, know it's going to happen. That's important preparation. Second thing I'd say is, Kim, please sit down with your partners before the setback happens and have a conversation about how you're going to handle it. And I know that's depressing. I'm not suggesting that's the first meeting, right? But I think you can even make this into a positive thing. So one of the things I've done with some folks who are starting the collaborations, say in 2025 and in Boston, is spend time with the partners now, writing down the article that will appear in the Boston Globe in 2030 that describes this amazing collaboration, who came together, how they came together, all the impact it's had positively. And reserve a few paragraphs for the setbacks. Like, what were the 1 or 2 big setbacks, and how did you come together to overcome them? Just so you get the sense among, not just you individually, but the partners, about how you'll manage the setbacks when they occur. That's important preparation. And then third and finally, there are the enablers that Santi mentioned. They are designed, I think they have a impact of making a learning journey more likely and a blame game less likely. So if you are building on prior relationships, then when the setback happens, you will have the reservoir of trust required to start learning. If you've got a trusted individual at the core of the collaboration, then when the setback happens, there'll be someone who will hold it together and will point toward learning and away from blaming. If you have got a focus on data and evidence, then when the setback happens, you'll have, it may still feel bad, but you can rely on evidence which makes it feel like the blame is not so personal, right? And then if you've got an investment you've made in joint problem solving, you've got the muscles already built to engage in the learning journey. One of the collaborations that we spent time with, for instance, they had bi-weekly meetings. And the meetings were designed to solve problems, just ongoing problems. And when a major setback hit, it was not a crisis, it was another bi-weekly meeting, right? And that, I think, makes a huge difference. Those are the kind of 3 things I'd say can help you prepare for the inevitable setbacks.
Okay. So it sounds like at the height of my excitement at my new collaboration, and with, I've got all the momentum ready to go, you would invite me and invite the teams you advise to prepare for a setback that we can't know the particulars of it yet, but we know is likely to
yes,
come.
The way you frame it there, it sounds like a complete downer, right? but I'd say if you work on it, if you think about it, this is the way you're going to build even greater trust.
Okay.
You'll come out of those things stronger than ever.
Okay.
So.
All right. So that's a really good thing to build into those early preparations.
Do it up front.
Yeah.
Like, get out in front of the problem.
Right. Okay. Fantastic.
Yeah.
I may come back to you with some other questions.
Fabulous.
Okay. Jorrit, you are the Emma Bloomberg Senior Lecturer here at the Kennedy School and the director of this center. And one way for those of you who are just getting to know the center, it's a problem-solving incubator. I think that might be one way to think about it. So what else do cities need to do to set themselves up for effective problem solving? You've given us, Santi and all of you, a set of perspectives and tools, but what can city leaders do to invest in the right conditions for tackling urban problems? And I know you oversee a very large research portfolio here at the center. So can you augment what you've shared so far?
Right. Thank you, and I'm going to do the same thing as Jan, thanking and congratulating Santi and wishing if you do this as well next week with your PhD defense, you'll be fine. So the hardest part is over, is what I'm saying. But thank you for your leadership of this project, and congratulations on the publication. And also thanks to you, Kim, for being the faculty chair of the collaboration track, because being in direct conversation with the leaders who do the work in cities of reducing crime, of creating inclusive growth, of reducing traffic congestion, that has informed this research. And because you lead that track, there's an opportunity to bring back the findings to the people who might benefit from it. And I think that cycle, I love your framing of problem-solving incubator. That cycle is critical to that work, and so the one part informs the other. And so this brings me back to your question. Brings me back to the very first questions that we asked ourselves when we started the work with mayors about 9 years ago, when Bloomberg Philanthropies reached out to Harvard and said, like, there's something missing in the world, and it is a program that allows mayors to grow on their jobs, right? You win election, and then all of a sudden you inherit a bureaucracy with thousands of people, and you inherit all these policy problems, and what are you going to do about it, right? And it's a lot of mayors describe their job as it's firefighting, and it's drinking from a fire hose, or it is kind of overwhelming. How do you pick your priorities, and most importantly, how do you deliver on what you've promised to your constituents? Now, we surveyed the mayors that were part of the first cohorts of the Bloomberg Harvard City Leadership Initiative, which is a collaboration between the business school, Bloomberg Philanthropies, and the Kennedy School. And they said, they gave us not such surprising answers. Well, what's on our mind is homelessness, affordable housing, climate change, and how we adapt to it, economic development, crime, opioid addiction, and so forth. So those were the problems we know as the typical urban issues that many small, medium-sized, and larger cities face. But then we ask another question: what organizational capabilities do you wish you had to tackle these problems? And what individual leadership skills would you like to develop to start working on this and make more progress and deliver results faster? And then they came with answers like, well, we know we need to use data, and we're using some data, but we doubt that we're using it effectively or efficiently or equitably or responsively. And so we'd like to get better at that. The second thing that they said is, we'd like to try new things, but that's very hard in the public sector because, there's not a lot of tolerance usually for trying things that don't work or that don't work immediately. And the third thing that they said is, we know that almost all of these policy issues require collaboration between different departments, let's say the police department and the fire department, or Parks and Rec and Public Works, or your education department and your health department. And while everybody is supposed to work for the same organization, it's very hard to get them to work together. And when we expand that beyond the boundaries of City Hall and working with other sectors, the private sector, businesses, nonprofit sector, grassroots organizations, it becomes even harder. So we felt like we got our work cut out for us, and we should look into that. And what we found is that there wasn't a lot of research that was both current and on current issues, and that produced actionable results. So maybe there was some research that was relevant, but it was mostly at the level of the national governments. Or it was mostly research focused on teaming in the private sector, but not in the public sector. Or it was the use of data in different types of organizations on different types of issues, but not on the urban issues that the mayors encountered. So we set out to launch 30 study projects, research projects, to try to fill that, what we call the triple knowledge gap. And collaboration, cross-sector collaboration, was an important part. We started with that, and in a way today we come full circle. But the major question was, well, what is making collaboration so hard, or so much harder than it needs to be? And Jan talked about it, and obviously Santi talked about it. And what we learned from some of these other studies was that many of these urban issues are so complex, and they weren't made yesterday. They have been sometimes decades or centuries in the making. And how do we make progress in the next 6 months or the next 3 years? And the biggest paradox is that if you want to tackle these larger issues, you got to find a way to start working on it. And you cannot solve it in one day. And if you need to work with other silos and sectors, you need to build that first trust to get into that cycle of learning. But if you're not sure if other organizations and other individuals are in it for the same reasons, if they maybe have hidden interests, if you're actually going to see any results in the near term, it makes it very hard to commit. And so we did a lot of research on what stands in the way. And one is the fact that it's hard to align on what the problem actually is. Mm-hmm. If you look at homelessness, is this a affordable housing problem? Is this a problem that's related to mental illness, to substance abuse? Is this a solidarity problem that gets at the level of the social compact and what we owe to each other? Or is it something else? And, obviously the answer is all of the above, right. But it depends on where you sit and how you see the problem, and how you see the problem informs what solutions you're willing to explore. So unpacking those dynamics in collaborations became really a priority, and a whole series of studies that we did with the initiative have now led to some insights that at least can help practitioners in cities acknowledge the barriers to collaboration and not be naive about it, to be clear-eyed. Well, we would be the exception in the world if we didn't encounter these barriers, mm-hmm. right? And so we might as well acknowledge it and then build a process that allows for us to come together, to invest in the collaboration itself, and to be prepared for those setbacks. And so, as Santi said, it's all theory building. Obviously, it's based on a lot of empirical research. It has produced some helpful insights and frameworks, but we're looking forward to do more research to then test these hypotheses and expand the theory and develop even more practical insights on these things. So again, what do you need to tackle these big problems? Well, you need to get started somewhere, and you might as well, pick an entry point that allows you to do something, then learn your way forward. And data, innovation, and collaboration across boundaries seem to be some of the core capabilities to do that work.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much, Jorrit, for that. And I think it's clear that the insights of people who are in cities working on problems are absolutely critical. But it's also clear that having research that you can point to, so at that moment of momentum, you can actually say, look, the studies show us that we're going to run into some troubles. Yeah. So instead of it being a downer, let's use it as an opportunity for us to move toward that entry point and to begin to, as Santi said, to be wearing both a researcher hat and a practitioner hat and have both of them inform the work that's happening in cities. So I'm going to ask you a little bit, each of you, very quickly, a lightning round, a question that's a little bit unfair, but so be it. So you've given us 5 enablers. You talked about prior relationships, having trusted participants, community engagement being critical, data, and then joint problem solving. If you had to tell a mayor, and I'm certain a mayor would ask you, or their chief of staff, tomorrow I need to double down on one of these, which one would you say they should double down on and why? And of course it's going to be dependent on the situation and the problem that they're focusing on. But can you give us a sense of why you might recommend one or the other as an entry point into cross-boundary collaboration? And maybe we'll start with you, Jen.
Okay. Cold call. So you are asking us to go beyond our research, and for researchers that's always a little uncomfortable, so I just want to warn the audience, we are now speculating, okay? But if I forced to speculate, here's what I'd say. I'd probably start with the prior relationships.
Okay.
Like working with prior relationships. And here's why. When you hit that setback, it's the prior relationships and the trust that accompanies them that are going to give you the ability to steer away from the blame that is tempting at that moment and toward the learning that is hard at that moment. I would say in my work in collaboration, I've discovered what I believe is the iron law of trust. Here's the iron law of trust. Trust is hardest to build exactly when you need it the most.
Right.
Hardest to build exactly when you need it the most. So if you wait until you need it to build it, you're probably sunk. Right. So you pose this as what to tell the mayors. And in fact, in the Bloomberg Mayors program, one thing I've mentioned often is you're the chief relationships officer. You're the chief trust officer in your city. And I want you to identify the individuals who you know need to have greater trust with one another in order to deal with a city issue in the future, perhaps one of these setbacks. And start building trust among those individuals before you need them. Mm-hmm. So I think that's the thing you need the most, and the reservoir from which you will pull when you face a setback. Okay. So that's my speculation. Okay.
Yeah.
What do you say?
Well, since we're speculating, we also don't have to be aligned.
Of course not. That's perfect. That's how we get new hypotheses.
It could all be true.
Yeah.
Let me pick another one of the
Great.
5, joint problem solving. And the reason I mentioned is we have a separate study with Professor Amy Edmondson of the Business School and Dr. Quinton Main and Dr. Kate Robb about what it takes to build a problem-solving culture in City Hall. And what I loved most about that research, and it's similar in a way to what you described about the exercises that we did, the group exercises with the 9 cities in this research. We asked them at some point, imagine a spaceship lands on the town commons. And the mayor has asked you, and we asked a group of an interdepartmental task force that was working on distressed properties. We asked them, like, just imagine the mayor asks you to drop your work on distressed properties and come up with a plan how to deal with the spaceship. And you don't know anything about it. And it could be a threat, it could be an opportunity, it could be, we don't know what the tools are to deal with this, there's no best practices or evidence-based policy around it. What do you do? And then we just observed how that group pivoted from distressed properties to dealing with a spaceship. And it was, this was based on previous research techniques and interview techniques. You just observe how the group grapples with a novel challenge, how they communicate with each other, who emerges as the leader, how much psychological safety there is to say.
And what's psychological safety? Right?
Is the confidence that if you come up with a stupid idea, that turns out to be stupid, it's not a stupid idea when you say it, well, sometimes maybe, but but in this case, it's like nobody knows the answer, so you might as well brainstorm. But in many organizations, that is hard because you don't want to be seen as not knowing the answer, et cetera. And so the psychological safety means that you're confident that it won't have negative, consequences for you if you say something that doesn't, necessarily work out. And so we observed 10 cities in a conversation about a spaceship. Obviously, we augmented that research with research on the distressed properties and on the real issues that we're working on. But the joint problem-solving orientation, the ability to work through a problem together, I think I would put my money on that as one of the most important things.
That's great, Santi.
It's hard to select one, and I'll just pick a different one, but I do think it's complementary in the sense that if I could pick, I'll do joint problem solving, but I do think it's not just problem solving by itself. It's also how it is complementary to, for example, using data to inform this joint problem solving, right? And I think that also comes from the fact that sometimes one of the biggest barriers that collaborations face, right, it's just building a shared understanding of the problem that they're tackling, right? Mm-hmm. And we see that not only in the collaborations that we studied, but also in many different cities that have gone through the collaboration track in the Bloomberg program, right? Which is that once you actually see people together in the same room and look at the data together. So it's not just collecting the data, but it's actually sitting down and looking at the data together. You start creating this shared interpretation of what the problem is, and that's the beginning of a shared understanding that then connects back to what Jong was saying, right? And I do think that is also like a key component that complements all of the others.
Can I just pick up on part of what Sunny's saying? The word complement, I think, is really important, because I think these three actually do work together, right? Yes. Prior relationships are much, much more powerful if you've got experience and an orientation toward joint problem solving. You know how to work together, right? And likewise, joint problem solving is more effective if it's informed by data and evidence.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
these things work together.
Right. So what I'm taking from this, and we're going to move very soon into inviting the audience, both online and here in the room, to ask some questions. But I think what you've shared with us is that when we think about collaboration, we may have our own mental model of what that involves. We may think of it as something that has to organically, just naturally, somehow emerge from people being in the same room. I think what you have shared with us and what the research, this project, and the portfolio of research that Jorrit mentioned, is that there's a science, if you will, to collaboration. There are actions that mayors and teams can take to set themselves on that learning journey. Now, it doesn't mean inevitably that the collaboration will yield what you hope. It may yield something terrific, but a little bit different than what you expected. But when we're thinking about collaboration and getting work done on complex problems, we're beginning to see that there's an evidence base for this work and an evidence base that cities and teams can draw on to guide their work ahead. So with that, let's thank our panelists for a very rich discussion. And I'd like to first invite anyone who's in the room to come to the mic. Please identify yourself, let us know who you are, and please ask your question. Yes.
Great. Can I go?
Please.
Okay. Hi, thank you so much for being here and sharing your research. I'm Sunny. I'm a second-year Master of Public Policy student at HKS. So my question is on the setback. I was wondering, like, in your research, like in your interviews, have you ever encountered stories about like different sectors or different stakeholders having like competing agendas, and you talk about this when people can't agree on what the problem is. Maybe they would have like a broad agreement, but like if they come with like different priorities, how would you deal with that? And I was wondering, on that note, like have you like seen like negotiation play like a key skill in the process? Thank you.
So competing interest and collaboration. Who would like to respond? Please.
Well, I really appreciate that question. And it reminds me that we haven't talked about negotiation, but it's an integral part of collaboration. And I think what we often see is that when people use the word collaboration, and you alluded to this, you know, there's maybe the connotation of some kumbaya. We'll all hold hands and we'll all work together, and you know, who can be against it, right? But there is always the reality of like you are committed and loyal to the department that you represent, and ultimately that department is evaluated on different performance metrics than the collaboration, right? And so there's an inherent tension in that work. And so what you're negotiating then, either explicitly or implicitly, is the boundaries and the loyalties. And you know, back to what Jen said is, you know, unless you surface that as an inherent tension, it's going to be hard to address it, right? And because it's inherent, you might as well have that conversation before it's needed, before it actually leads to a setback when things fall apart. So what I would say is it's important to see the negotiation aspect in every collaboration, but it's also important to look beyond the negotiation aspect. It's also more than just deal making, and so I think to be intentional about it is the start, and it doesn't solve it necessarily. You have to work through it, but sometimes you see that, oh, I thought we were all going to work together, but how come that all of a sudden they pull their support? Well, you know, that's why.
Yeah. Can I follow up?
Please.
Sonny, when you asked, in these collaborations, have we ever seen competing agendas cause problems, my first reaction was instinctively like, I've never seen that not happen, right? It's almost, as your word inherent, right? It's almost inherent in the nature of it. You've got folks from different sectors who have different interests, and I think you can't avoid that. And then the question is, can you actually make the most out of those differences, right? Can you turn the differences into sources of imagination and creativity as opposed to sources of conflict and downward spiral? So I think that it's absolutely part and parcel of both the challenge but also the promise of this form of getting things done.
Some of our negotiation colleagues even think of negotiation as joint problem solving itself. So you can see that there's a kind of synergy there. Let's go and take one question from our online listeners, and then we'll come back to you here in the room. So one of our listeners asks, I'm curious to know what counted as a setback in the research. Losing a funding stream seems straightforward, but were there more subtle kinds of setbacks that you saw that turned out to be significant? It's a great question.
There were just so many different things that classified as setback, right? Like not only funding, but say for example, one of the collaborations, in two cases, right? Like they were being hosted in a particular organization, and not that they lost the funding, but they basically lost the support of that particular organization. And what I thought is interesting about that specific case is that they had to rearrange their structure to continue functioning. And that was the same case for the other collaboration, right? And I do think, again, going into, we can talk about examples in public safety. This one in particular was about education. It's the different, let's say the different types of moments, because it's not just like one specific moment that defines the setback, right? But like you're encountering setbacks in different moments, and you can just like draw their different trajectories, right? And I think that's one specific example in which we saw the same setback happening to different organizations, to just illustrate a little bit of one particular case that counted as something that may or may not be seen as a setback.
Jen, would it be, in preparing a team for setbacks, would it be helpful for them to even identify potential setbacks?
I think definitely. I think they may not, their ability to predict perfectly, I think, would be very limited.
Yeah.
But to make it quite concrete, this is the kind of thing that could happen, I think is extraordinarily valuable.
Okay.
Right, to actually have the real conversation about how we'd respond to this or that. I very much appreciate the question, and one of the nice things about hypothesis building research is it often spurs on other research. And I think a natural next question would be, are there different categories of setbacks that require different kinds of responses?
Okay, so that might be the next paper.
Yeah, exactly. The next dissertation, actually.
Yes.
And,
okay.
And maybe let me just complement that by sharing a little bit of one of the things that we did with these specific collaborations. Is one of the tools that we used was a group exercise where we had a list of 18 barriers, if I'm not mistaken, and what we did was that we gave this list and asked each of the participants in the collaboration to rank them. Right, and we didn't share it with who responded what, but we actually aggregated those results. And what we saw, and not to share the specifics of each collaboration, is that in some of them there was certain agreement about what the barrier was, and in other ones there was not even agreement on what the main barrier was. Right, so to the response here, we call them setbacks, right? But at the end of the day, sometimes the people in the room don't really agree on what is a setback or what is the setback that they are talking about. And we've identified, this list has at least 18 possibilities, right? And that should be, the next paper, but that's just a way to show that there is a typology which we started. And I think that in the different cases, even people from the same collaboration saw setbacks and barriers in a different way.
By the way, for research methodology, I thought the group interviews were enormously revealing. So anyone doing work in
team together,
collaboration,
yeah.
have the whole team together and observe their points of view, but also the differences and have them interact.
Okay.
Very revealing.
Please.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for the panel. Congratulations on the research and good luck next week with your defense. I'm Julia. I'm a Loeb Fellow at Harvard. And I have a question about enduring cross-sector collaborations. So just to reveal a bias, I'm from LA and I used to work at the mayor's office there. And we had some very successful cross-sector collaborations around doing things like you described in the research, which were very discrete tasks. For example, passing a sales tax measure around raising money to build out public transit in order to improve traffic congestion. But we don't really have enduring cross-sector collaborations on actually improving traffic congestion. And so I wondered if you could extrapolate or maybe speculate a little bit on the research to look beyond the case studies, which, if I'm understanding them correctly, really have these discrete tasks and outcomes associated with them, to just talk more broadly about what you think is necessary for successful, enduring cross-sector collaborations that might go across multiple tasks and outcomes in achieving a much larger and maybe more nebulous aim.
While the panel is responding, can you just tell us what a Loeb Fellow is for those who may not know?
Absolutely. So the Loeb Fellowship is at the Harvard Graduate School of Design. There's actually multiple people in here who are doing the Loeb Fellowship. It's a year-long residency at Harvard for people who've worked on or in cities, multidisciplinary, so does a number of different things.
Fantastic.
Yep.
Want to talk about the Columbus partnership?
Sure. So what Jorrit is asking is, do I want to talk about the Columbus Partnership, which is a case that I wrote, Julia, years back. And I'm not sure, I mean, it is a CEO-led civic alliance that has engaged cross-sectors to solve a series of challenges in Columbus, Ohio. Really remarkably accomplished group. Similarly, a Tasca project in Minneapolis, St. Paul. And they are, it's interesting, I think in many instances what happens is there is a overarching cross-sector collaboration which then spawns efforts of, to address opportunities or challenges as they arise, and they actually generate a series of kind of child cross-sector collaborations that tackle particular issues. So as a parent that feeds that. So that's at least my one view of the Columbus Partnership. Again, I think a remarkable organization, and there are many cities that have things like that.
I can share. Did you want? Oh, I could share an example from Louisville, Kentucky, where we studied how a cross-sector collaboration to create scholarships for disadvantaged young people to go to college started as a very focused effort to raise money and create these opportunities. And then at some point, the question was, well, if we raise the money, will people actually be able to benefit from it? Because they might drop out before they raise the point where they go to college. And if we break that down along racial lines, we might actually see a big racial inequality. And so if we really want to create equitable opportunity, to go to college and to be employed and so forth, and create social mobility, then we might have to do some other things first, which involved creating wraparound services, as they call them, community hubs, etc. So that brought in other partners, but it also slowed down the process because now there were so many more organizations to get aligned on. And then as they were doing that work, they realized, well, maybe we need to take one step back, and maybe there's something structurally wrong with the way we've thought about workforce development, economic development, and maybe there's a few other things that need to happen before people can even take advantage of these wraparound services. And obviously, the collaboration grew even more, and new issues emerged that they had to work through. And then as the collaboration went from year to year, they started losing people because, on one hand they matured and they had more insights and they made some progress, but then the trust that was built among the people who started it, when people leave, you got to rebuild that trust all over again, and then maybe they have to go through that process of alignment. So I really find it interesting, this question about like the longer a collaboration lasts. It probably also depends on how long people last within that collaboration, right? And so on one hand, you build some kind of institutional memory, but that could also leave. And so you got to, in a way, build the trust all over again and create that alignment all over again. Now, what happened in the case of Louisville is during the pandemic, they faced an urgent crisis like most cities, because people couldn't go to school anymore, and kids that didn't have access to a computer at home couldn't attend school. So they created these, hubs, community hubs where there was access to computers. And then they kept those hubs so that they were in place after the pandemic, and then build out from there. So what we often see is there's these pivotal moments or inflection points in the collaboration where all of a sudden you can move faster. And I think really great leaders see that opportunity. In Louisville, that was the case. And it's sometimes conversations that become really bogged down and really, heavy, and get this paralysis paralysis. When you find an opportunity to accelerate and find focus, you can move it to the next level. And that's what they did there. But you also see that some other collaborations, including some of the ones that we studied in this paper, just kind of dissolve. It's not a setback; it's a slowdown, and ultimately, everybody's like, what are we still doing here? Mm-hmm. And so I think a lot of collaborations perish before they peak. Yeah.
Actually, Julie's question has me thinking of another question for you, Jorrit. I know that you and co-authors have done work on entry points for collaborations. Have you studied exit points?
Exit points.
When it's interesting. That's really interesting.
It's best to move on.
No, we haven't. But there you go.
Another dissertation.
As you just said, it generates new research questions.
Yeah. That's great.
Let's take another question from in the room, and then maybe one more in the room after that, and then we'll close with one from our online audience.
Cool.
Yeah.
Hi, my name's Danny. Thanks so much for your time and sharing insights from the research. On the theme of setbacks, I'd love to ask your insights in a situation where there has been a historical erosion of trust, in a situation where you do have to collaborate, you have to reconcile and to move forward to find a solution. So if we take this spaceship example, we can kind of theorize it as, what if the spaceship has come before and it's caused a lot of trauma or a lot of harm for those who are also working to try and come up with the solution? So I wonder if the principles would still stand, or if you have other thoughts on where that difficulty in the entry point, how would that kind of play out?
Well, that's a very important question around historical trauma and antecedent events and how they affect the collaborative process. Any thoughts there, Santi?
Yeah, maybe our first thought there is like whether the trust is on the collaboration itself or on the individuals that come to collaborate. And I'll just point back to the finding about like a trusted individual. And in some of the cases, what we saw is that the trust on that individual happened even before the collaboration was a thing, even before it was an actual concept, right? Is that they talk about the trajectory of these trusted leaders, boundary spanners, people that have worked in the field in many different sectors and in many different roles that carry that trust with them, right? That when the time of the collaboration comes, then that brings that trust as an asset into the collaboration, right? So that's one of the things that we saw. And I don't know specifically like the scenario that you might be thinking, right? But like if you think about that erosion of trust, so the question is like, is that erosion of trust on the government that is trying to like put together the collaboration, and then that doesn't really mean that all collaborations were government initiated or government led, right? But in a lot of the successful ones, what we saw is that regardless of where the collaboration started, this person brought the trust and put that, let's say initial personal trust or individual trust that that they had been, let's say, creating over their work in a particular sector. Oh, yeah.
I just doubled down on that. I think particularly in some of the collaborations around public safety, like interpersonal trust of an individual was the interim solution to generate trust that could then start to have the flywheel that Santi described, and where, in an area where there is an historical deep erosion of trust.
Jorrit?
Yeah, just to build on that, 3 real quick examples of cities that found an entry point that allowed them to build the trust to then move forward. One is South Yorkshire in the United Kingdom. They wanted to do something about health equity, but that's a really big problem, and cities have limited authority or resources to do something about it. But you got to start somewhere. And Mayor Oliver Coppert said, okay, I'm going to put together a team, cross-sector team, and I'm going to give them the permission to find an entry point, to something to work on, as long as it allows us to identify what's next. And so they created the program Beds for Babies, because they found out that 1 in 9 babies comes home from the hospital with the mother, and there's no safe crib. And you might say, well, giving a family a crib, is wonderful, and it's an immediate need is being met. But what does that do about health equity in the longer term? Turns out that if you deliver that crib, you also have an encounter. You come into the home of a family. You see other things. You build a relationship. You give people the experience that they're cared for and that they can trust their government, at least in that moment. And so that allows you to kind of learn new things and build out from there. Same thing with the city of Breda in the Netherlands, where I'm from. There was a real concern about illegal grow houses where marijuana was being grown. And the assumption was there's, criminals behind it. Turned out that was true, but it was also low-income residents were being exploited. They were being paid to use their spare attic and so forth. So they wouldn't collaborate because they felt under pressure and they were not going to tell the government about what was really going on. So what they had to do is to not, go in through the lens of criminal justice and drug crime, but basically emphasize fire safety, because there's a increased fire risk with these grow houses. And so they had a fire safety campaign, an awareness campaign, and that built the trust because that was caring for their safety rather than, prosecuting the criminals and criminalizing their behaviors. And so those are 2 examples where an entry point allowed the government and other partners to build trust with the community, which was then necessary to find out the next steps.
I want to make sure we take our last question, I think, from our online listeners, and it's a very practical one. With limited capacity and resources, and we certainly know that that's the case in many cities across the globe, what skills might civil servants need to develop to do this cross-sector work well? I know that's a big question, but I wonder if we can have a relatively quick answer from 1 or 2 of you.
And as the chair of the collaboration track, we may also ask you to chime in too, Kim. Is that fair?
Fair enough.
So,
but please go ahead.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would start by highlighting again the joint problem solving and just the intentionality in it, right? And I do think that it requires like certain skill to like keep coming, together with a team despite all of the things that might come up. And I think that like that sometimes, unfortunately, it's hard to maintain, let's say, that stamina and that endurance to keep collaborating, right? And I think that frequency and that continuity of engaging in joint problem solving, it's a specific, I would call it a skill, and very important as our research showed.
Yeah.
I would say adopting a both and mindset rather than an either or. It's easy when you look at the paradoxes of collaboration to say, oh, we want to fix this really big urban problem, but that's too complex, and so we can only focus on something that's in the here and now, right in front of us, but that's not meaningful enough, right? Well, it can mean that's your entry point, and it allows you to work on the bigger thing. So both and, or can we reconcile the loyalty to your own department or your own organization and loyalty and commitment to the collaboration? It's not either or. Sometimes it's possible to find a way to do both, but it does require that joint problem solving and that attitude. And if you bring that, some of these things that seem impossible turn out to be a lot more possible.
So those are skills that you can cultivate on your own, even if there are no added resources.
Yeah.
Jan, did you want
so many skills required. I mean, one side I'd add on are things we've talked about. Negotiation, right?
Okay.
Ongoing negotiation. To your point, that's often inherent in problem solving. Experimentation, right? The capacity to try things out, have hypotheses, test them efficiently, and the use of data.
And the use of data.
Use of data.
Whatever data you have, the best data you have. Okay.
Yeah, and I don't know if there's a skill around persistence and courage, but that for our public servants, deeply necessary for this work.
Yeah. So courage also as an important skill that one can cultivate. Putting on our collective Bloomberg Center hat, I would also say that if you go to the website for the center, you'll see that our cases are available, our practitioner insights, and many of the tools that you've heard mentioned today are available for you to use in different contexts, in your own learning if you're a student, in your own research, and if you're a practitioner and working in cities, either as a city leader or as a community leader. These tools are available for you to draw on as well. I want to express my deep appreciation to this panel, to the audience here in the room, to the audience online. And I just want to close by mentioning and highlighting the importance of asking good questions, which is really what research is fundamentally about. Research allows you to get some answers, maybe not definitive ones always, but the next set of answers and questions to problems that are taking place in cities. And they challenge all of us, good questions, to make our cities work as effectively as possible, whether here in Cambridge, Massachusetts, in Allentown, Pennsylvania, in Bogota, Colombia, Athens, Greece, or in any of the other cities that this center and the Bloomberg Harvard City Leadership Initiative serves. So with that, we thank you for joining us. We invite you to stay connected and to share your expertise with us. And let's thank the panel and wish Santi well next week.